Many of the messages that I'm delivering this summer and fall are drafts of chapters of our current book project, America Will Be Great When. And the whole project is obviously a bit of pushback to President Trump's vision of making America great, which appears to be a rather racist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic smokescreen to cover up a massive transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the super rich. Amen. I'm working with David and Holly Ketchum, Dr. Paul Tomlinson, to address issues of addiction, access to education, as well as poverty, gender and sexual prejudice, matters of war and peace, environment, racism, gun control, the judicial and penal system, and maintaining democratic values. Our book is largely a spiritual look at ethics and the challenges that currently face our nation. The underlying theme of the book is that most of these horrible problems actually have fairly simple solutions that are already being successfully implemented in other countries. And all we're trying to do is to get Americans to wake up to those facts. The other author working on the project that I've not mentioned yet is Dr. Nicole Fisk. We have both written on immigration and the refugee crisis. And in keeping with the rest of the book project, we have written from a spiritual and ethical perspective to dispel inaccurate prejudice and to call upon our better angels, as it were, to take a more compassionate approach to both immigrants and refugees. Today, I want to add one more segment to that conversation in the book, but I'd like to step out of my role as a pastor and an ethicist to talk about this from a more flat-footed, economic, self-interest perspective. I believe that the real art of the deal, to call it that, is not to win by making someone else lose, but rather to find sufficient common ground so that everybody wins. The best deal is where both sides come out ahead. Amen. Thanks. When it comes to the topic of immigration, those of us on the church side, we want to talk about compassion. We want to use Old Testament language of welcoming the stranger. But we also really have common ground with Wall Street and corporate interest and even the Pentagon when it comes to this one. I was intrigued by a lecture delivered by Dr. Richard Wolff, who's an emeritus economics professor at the University of Michigan at Amherst. He explains that looked at from a purely economic perspective, a person's least productive time of life is their first 20 years. Children consume goods, but they don't produce goods, or they shouldn't produce goods. In a civilized society, they shouldn't be producing anything. In most countries, parents sacrifice to raise and educate their children who, for an entire generation, consume medical services, they eat, they have to be housed. They also require a lot of sacrifices for education and for childcare. So when a 20-year-old immigrant comes to the United States, we are inheriting an economic asset that is ready to enter the productive, income-generating, tax-paying time of their lives, which is why both countries and communities complain about brain drain when too many of their young people seek to leave to seek their fortunes elsewhere. A child requires a huge investment in the future. So every immigrant who comes here is an investment that is being made in our country, often by a much poorer country that cannot really afford to do it for us, but we're acting like they're somehow a tax on us when in fact we're inheriting a gold mine every time an able-bodied laborer shows up in our country. Amen. We often hear that illegal immigrants are a drain on our tax-supported services, and while there are some medical and educational expenses involved in their presence here, by and large, they are paying taxes and cannot legally receive benefits from the taxes that they're paying. They're paying into Social Security, they're paying into Medicare, they're paying into Medicaid, but they don't get to draw out of those things. I personally think that it's wrong to make them pay if they don't get to legally draw out again, but looked at, again, from a purely economic perspective, if you just talk about the math involved in this, illegal immigrants are not only doing back-breaking labor that few American citizens would want to do, even if they were paying 2 or 3 times as much for the labor, you still couldn't get many Americans to do it. But at the same time, they are subsidizing our social safety net. It's not fair, but it works to the favor of American citizens. Now, I personally wish that we could turn Central, North, and South America into the kind of union that Europe has had, in which people could move as freely as capital now moves. We have very strict laws, and Trump wants to build a fence along our southern border to keep people from moving around. But while you can restrict people, you can't really restrict the movement of money. Money is fungible. So money will go to wherever labor is cheaper and where safety and environmental laws are more lax. If we made it so that people could move as easily as money moves, we could keep production closer to the point of consumption while keeping workers' salaries higher and working conditions safer and less of an environmental damage. Now, this is not even something that's under conversation in the Americas, but just think about if we just quit all of this fear of immigration and allowed all of the Americas to be one economic union. We maintain sovereignty of Canada and the United States and Mexico and what have you, but we have an economic union that makes labor as fungible as capital, and it would solve tremendous problems. It would be good for Wall Street. It would be good for the environment. It would be good for labor. And it would give we liberals one less thing to whine about. And wouldn't conservatives love that? Speaking of things that liberals are mad about, though, just think about how this would solve the DACA problem. We're now threatening to deport 80,000 young, productive, educated, law-abiding, tax-paying people, deporting them possibly to a nation where they don't even speak the language. I mean, if you were brought here, I adopted my daughter when she was 4 months old from Korea, and for years we'd go to Korean restaurants and the waitresses would be angry that she didn't speak Korean. I said, she speaks as much Korean as your kid did when your kid was 4 months old. That these kids who were brought to the United States by their parents oftentimes learned English first and became the family translator, and they don't even have the skills to get a job if we deport them to Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador. We would literally be assassinating their work life. They would become indigent in their country of birth because they don't know how to make a living there. But from a purely economic perspective, we need for them to stay. They are an economic asset to us. It's also relevant to point out that statistically, both the Dreamers and other illegal immigrants have a much lower crime rate than native-born Americans. You think about it. If you are not a citizen and you draw any legal attention to yourself, you don't just get a fine or get sent to jail for a couple of weeks, you get deported. The undocumented are even much more careful drivers than the rest of us because they don't want to draw attention to themselves by so much as a speeding ticket that might drag them into court and have their citizenship questioned. By and large, our cities are safer and more civil and require less expenditure in a police force when we have more undocumented workers among us. Now, when it comes to matters of what has truly made America the world's center for invention in the STEM topics, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, we have a crucial and tragically overlooked economic issue in America right now. When I was at Harvard, I often rode the subway line that connected MIT and Harvard and Boston's subway. And that subway was a virtual United Nations. When we came to a stop under MIT, it was impossible not to notice that most of the Arabs and Asians got off the train. It's inescapable to be aware that we are drawing the geniuses of Asia and the Middle East and Africa to the United States. Now, Harvard, and I enjoyed my time at Harvard and proud to have been there, but you can get into Harvard if your parents or grandparents went. There's a lot of, I'd like to say that I was around the smartest people I've ever been around, but there were some real dummies in the class whose parents had just either donated enough money or had the blue blood lines to get them into Harvard. MIT doesn't play that game. You get into MIT if you are the smartest and the best. 1 out of 18 or 20 of their applicants actually get in, and 10% of the people at MIT are from 63 nations around the world. So we siphon off other nations' best and brightest. And one of the ways that America became such a global force in science and technology is exactly because we happen to have the best schools, so we attracted the best students from the world for the past 100 years. And in very many cases, we kept them. They graduated, we gave them a green card, and they stayed here. Very many of these brilliant young inventors, physicians, and scientists are now being told to take their valuable education and go home. We've become very conservative about giving green cards and permission for people to stay, and so they come here, they take up the seat in classrooms in STEM topics, they get the degree, and then we tell them to go away. Many of you know a great deal more about American history than I do, but I believe that it's fair to say that if we had the aggressive immigration restrictions that we have today in the first half of the 20th century, such immigrants as Albert Einstein and the German parents of Robert Oppenheimer would have been in Germany during World War II. And without them, it's difficult to believe that we would have won World War II. And if they had been pressed into the service of the Nazis, we might well have lost World War II, and the world would be a different place. It's difficult to imagine what American science, as well as art, music, theater, movies, or culture would be without the influence of just the German Jewish population that immigrated to the United States in the early 20th century. But like many of you, my day begins and ends being impacted all day long by my iPhone, my iPad, my Apple laptop, all of which are traced to the genius of the son of a Syrian immigrant, Steve Jobs. I'm sorry to show this to you on a Sunday morning without warning, but might this little Syrian refugee have been the next Steve Jobs? Due largely to our self-defeating refugee policy, we will never know. I'm more than a little uncomfortable talking about public policy issues from the perspective of practical economics. Ethics is my religious language, and I would much prefer to talk about what is right and doing what is good rather than talking about what is profitable and useful. But when it comes to matters of refugee, resettlement, and immigration, ethics and economics share, albeit uncomfortably, the same policy interest. Economics and ethics can be side by side. Our spiritual instincts, as articulated by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the church in Philippi, are to make the plight of others our own concern. Religious people instinctively know that compassion is our default setting, And so from the days of ancient Israelites, we've known that welcoming the stranger and treating the foreigner in our midst with justice and mercy, we've always known that that's the right thing to do. Our irrational fear of others has stupidly led us to leave our farming industry so bereft of workers that our food is often left rotting in the fields. And while we can still boast that we have the best universities in the world in these United States, we are ignorantly exporting many of the world's greatest geniuses, preventing them from keeping the United States of America in the forefront of invention and innovation. Now, several Republican leaders have lately been bemoaning the fact that they have become, to a very large extent, the party of stupid. They desperately want to change. And we who may typically consider ourselves to not be Republicans also desperately want for them to change. We want them to stop being the party of stupid, because whether you come at it at some of these issues purely from an accounting bottom line or from some tree-hugging, bleeding heart snowflake perspective, we have every reason to stop this expensive and poorly thought out wall on the border between the United States and Mexico. We need to absolutely refuse to accept a ban on Muslim immigration. And we need to come back from the back of the pack in terms of leadership in refugee resettlement and get to the forefront, because this is a nation that has enjoyed the richness of diversity of an immigrant community. And accepting refugees into our country will make our country better, not more dangerous. And that, you may say, is just my opinion. But if you check my facts, you will discover that I also happen to be right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.